is your brain on menopause? I get lots of questions about brain symptoms in my practice, so it's always top of mind. Just a reminder that this is just for educational purposes only, and I'm not replacing the counsel of your own physician. So in my practice, lots of women ask me about brain-related symptoms, connecting them to perimenopause and menopause, like changes in mood, anxiety or irritability. Brain fog is a big one. Memory changes, like short-term memory and sometimes long-term memory changes. But what I really see them asking is sort of the undercurrent or the underlying worry is like, do these things mean I'm going to have dementia? I mean, my patient population I'm working with is often caring for family members or parents that have dealt with dementia. And that's sort of like their symptoms are definitely bothering them day to day and top of mind. But the underlying worry is that they're signs of dementia. The good news is most cases they're not. So to think about that, we have to think about what our memory actually is and the different types of memory. So we have procedural memory, which is what we use when we're learning something new, like learning to dance, playing a piano, golfing, playing tennis. So to keep that going, you want to be learning new tasks. So pick up a new sport, pick up a new game, learn something new. Relational memory is the part of memory that deals with facts and events, like someone's name, the actor that was in a movie, the title of the movie, but it's relational, meaning like the way that your brain remembers it is it relates to other things that either that fact is related to, or like when you learned that fact or watched that movie, like what else was going on in the information it was taking in. So relational memory sort of takes a lot of work to bring those things back up, that person's name or the movie titles. That's why you may be struggling with that sometimes, is because it has to file a lot of information. A lot of the symptoms that women in perimenopause and menopause experience has to do with working memory, because that's our short-term memory where we just file things, sort them, and then able to retrieve it, like things in the past few days. But for that to work really well, for us to be able to take something in short-term memory, we have to block out distractions and really focus on that thing and focus to learn that to actually train the brain that that fact was important enough to hold on to. Because if we're distracted when that information comes in, the working memory just gets the idea that, well, that wasn't really that important. So we're not holding on to it. We don't have the capacity for that. This is like phone numbers, directions to where you're going, the grocery list, somewhat trivial things, where your keys are or your phone, those things. They're often things that we repeat a lot. So the brain doesn't necessarily say like, oh, this time it's important to remember where my keys are because you like put them somewhere different every day or put them down every day. So a lot of the symptoms that you might experience have to do with working memory and not actually like a change in the brain architecture or structure. Relational memory is definitely affected by the aging process. Just because it is relational and we're using that information to retrieve the information, we're comparing it to what we already know. And just going through normal life, you build a huge library of what you've experienced and what you know. So even if the thing you're trying to retrieve is trivial, like your, I don't know, your friend's middle name, your roommate's middle name from college or something like that. Your brain has to go through the whole library to go back to college and then kind of filter through everything. And the brain gets a little distracted along that journey and finds other things to think about and whatnot. So it's not really that the brain structure is not working, it's just it has like more files to go through and more books to look at. Working memory affected really by stress. Our stress hormones, the stress that we're under causing us to be distracted, the inflammation caused by stress, lack of sleep or lack of sleep quality, those things affect working memory. It is conditionally affected by age. So some things we see as the aging process goes on does affect working memory as far as like the structural changes we have each decade that we're alive, the changes in our blood flow to our brain as we deposit more plaque in our arteries. That affects working memory, inflammation levels, and hormones do too. So there's some part of it that has to do with aging, but it's not directly because the brain is older. Some good news is that what happens in perimenopause is temporary. So we do have hormonal fluctuations in perimenopause that we've talked about. But perimenopause is a little bit for the brain like puberty, where in puberty, our brains are pruning all of the connections we've made as we're learning and growing as children and deciding like what to keep to be an adult. And a lot of that is driven by testosterone and estrogen. So like the nerve connections we keep as women are really driven by estrogen. And then in perimenopause, when the estrogen levels are changing, that's like severing some of those connections, but this is only temporary severing the connections. A lot of the connections and pieces of the brain that I don't want to say decline or they get smaller or like lower energy during perimenopause. A lot of those have to do with taking care of others and multitasking. Because we think of it, the brain is preparing for you not to have young kids anymore and not to be reproducing anymore and like taking care of everybody. So it's rewiring for your body and your brain to be more independent and to do more of what you want to do. So it's temporary pruning. There's a temporary decline in brain energy as your brain's getting used to the changes in estrogen levels. And then post menopause, we see the brain energy come back up. So the whole, like the amount of work the brain's able to do comes back up to, we'll say, like your normal levels. Not the areas of the brain that are working harder change a little bit. Again, like post menopause, like you're not necessarily taking the brain doesn't really care if you're taking care of other people or not anymore, I guess I should say. So it has different areas that it cares about. Menopause with that estrogen lowering causes the hippocampus to shrink, which does change memory a little bit. And it causes the hypothalamus to not regulate body temperature or our circadian rhythm as well. And that's kind of like another layer for the brain triggering night sweats, hot flashes, and trouble sleeping. That has to do with the brain changing and adjusting with the changing estrogen levels. Also, stress and cortisol change brain architecture, lack of sleep, autoimmunity comes into play too when we're thinking of brain health and function. Cross reactions, if you're reacting to particularly gluten or dairy, those compounds can cross the blood-brain barrier and actually trigger the brain in different areas. The Hashimoto's, which is a special type of hypothyroidism, can change brain architecture, and then ulcerative colitis and Crohn's. So if you already have one of those things going on and then going into perimenopause, it's going to cause a lot more symptoms. And then we have heavy metal exposure, which heavy metals like arsenic and mercury are more fat soluble, and our body likes to like hold them in fat, and the brain is made out of fat. So that's like if we're having an overexposure, we'll put more of it into the brain, and that affects its function. Unrelated to perimenopause, but just another layer of stuff that can happen at the same time. What I see most in my practice as we're running labs and looking into hormone levels is that stress is usually the culprit more than anything else. And that's probably just because of our modern lives that we're living. Um, Even if you're not feeling mental and emotional stress, your brain probably is, because the amount of information that is in one issue of the Sunday Times, that amount of information that we have now just in like one newspaper is more information than our forefathers in the colonial times would experience in their whole lifetime. And we basically have the same brain. The brain hasn't like evolved beyond that. And we have so much information coming in, the brain does feel stressed. When the stress signals are amplified, the brain is in alarm mode, and cannot rein in emotions, but which we may feel sometimes. It's not in our control. But one of the big things is it's unable to clear away inflammation. And we're continuously creating inflammation in our brain just as part of a normal metabolism and getting through the day. And when we're sleeping, that's when we clear away that plaque or inflammation. But if cortisol is present, then that blocks our ability to clear away beta amyloid plaque specifically, and other inflammation. And the beta amyloid plaque is one of the things that's contributed to increased risk for Alzheimer's and dementia. In the short term, we have more brain fog and less short-term memory. We're under stress again, like that causes that distraction that the information doesn't fully get in. And cortisol itself blocks long-term recall. So it like kind of blocks our ability to kind of go through our whole library of books and recall information. So I think all of those reasons, plus just the stress that women are under, are reasons that I see that coming up more often is like the reason for their mood changes or brain fog. But there's also um, other types of inflammation can cause brain fog, and again, autoimmune conditions and inadequate sleep. And brain fog is a little bit different because it's more like if you think of a dense fog, it's not necessarily not being able to remember something too quickly. It's more that your brain really feels like it has to work harder and work through a dense fog to do anything. So more of like a brain sluggishness and like cloudiness of thinking. Um, Almost that sometimes women, when they have brain fog, don't realize that they're not remembering things. Like we can get frustrated, like, oh, I can't remember the name of that movie. And you're talking to someone and you're like, oh, I'll get it, in 2 hours when I'm not talking to you anymore. But the brain fog is just kind of like almost being like mid-sentence and just kind of trailing off, like the fog is so thick. There's lots of things we can do to heal this and help us, though. So I have a few suggestions, things to think about. One of them is thinking about your gut. The brain-gut communication is very tight. It's a two-way street through the vagus nerve and your hormones. Most of our serotonin receptors are in the gut. Most of our serotonin is made in the gut. And then when estrogen declines in perimenopause and menopause, we produce less serotonin. So it does, and part of that is, well, is it because the lower estrogen causes lower serotonin in the brain, or is it because of the changes in gut bacteria that happen because of the lower estrogen? And now more recent research is looking at the changes in the gut bacteria because of estrogen levels changing and think that's why the serotonin levels lower for women in perimenopause and menopause. So it's all coming from the gut. We have lots of research showing that the changes in gut bacteria can lead to different neurological diseases like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. So there is that was where so they sort of like established the gut-brain connection. And recent studies have shown just going 2 hours of under stress, it completely changes the gut bacteria that you have as far as the species that you have and the numbers of bacteria that you have. So it's very reactive to our stress levels, which is, you can kind of look at it in a good way, is that if you have less stress for a few hours, it also rebounds. So it's reactive both ways. Depending on the food that you have different changes in gut bacteria species and numbers too, like sugar versus fiber. And it's shown that the probiotic bacteria respond pretty quickly to changes in diet, which is one of the reasons why food is medicine, as we were talking about. And small changes or consistent changes in diet can make a big change in like how you're sleeping, serotonin, which has a lot to do with pain perception, and dopamine and GABA. So there's a connection there. It's probably mostly mediated by the probiotics. What's happening for women in menopause is we're losing our flora diversity. So like the different types of bacteria species that we have. So when we're born as females, we have a much more diverse flora than males. And that even gets even greater when we go through puberty in response to estrogen. Part of the reason is we need so many different types of bacteria to metabolize estrogen and detox estrogen. So that's a good thing. These bacteria also play a role in metabolism and increasing GLP-1 production, particularly Akkermansia. And Akkermansia is not seen in men very much. And so there was that estrogen connection. And now we've seen as women go through menopause, their Akkermansia species die off. And this is one of the key species that helps all the other species of probiotics be happy in the gut. So it kind of like regulates the whole gut. It's not a species that we think about when we think about like treating like constipation or diarrhea. That's more like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. But this species more regulates the situation in the gut to make other bacteria healthy and happy. It increases GLP-1 production and has a role in our metabolism in that way. And it creates better postbiotics, which are the compounds that our probiotic bacteria make, which are butyrates and different and things that decrease inflammation in the intestines. So Akkermansia, even though it's not like known really to treat some like gut conditions. It seems to be sort of like the bottleneck when we're thinking about like metabolism and hormones and happy gut. So that's something I talk to my patients about if they're starting to notice like gut changes through menopause. Bloating, is usually what people say. Catch-all term for like gut change. So the probiotics is one thing to think about. The other thing to think about is blueberries, which is pretty easy to do, especially as we're getting into summer and more berries available. There's lots of research on blueberries for brain health, but just a half a cup a day was that equivalent was shown to improve working memory, ability to like go through mazes and learn mazes and things like that. So um, I always recommend blueberries, like put it in smoothies or in your overnight oats. Frozen blueberries work too. But half a cup a day isn't a huge amount. And so it's something worth considering to like make habit. Something else that's interesting is resveratrol. So I actually found a couple studies using resveratrol for postmenopausal brain health when I was looking for a patient, looking for something that was not calcium and not estrogen to help her with bone density. So resveratrol has been studied to increase bone mineral density in both hips and spine in postmenopausal women. But as I was looking at the studies, I saw that it also improved cognition by 33% as far as like working memory and like processing speed, which when you think about supplements and what's been studied or kind of what's promoted as like brain health formulas, and memory formulas, most of those ingredients and most of the studies are focused on more advanced age and cognitive decline of advanced age that has to do with blood flow to the brain, like thinking of people in their 70s plus, and not really focused on working memory and processing speed. So this was why this was such a good study showing that resveratrol, which is an anti-inflammatory, still is able to help processing speed and working memory and cognitive flexibility. And we'll say, even though they're postmenopausal women, they were younger adults for like a memory study. They were like 55 to 75. So if you want to eat resveratrol, it's in red grape skins, berries, again, like that may be one of the things in blueberries or blackberries. That's helpful, and a little bit in pomegranate. But I do mention pomegranate because pomegranate has so many other beneficial aspects to it, and it's pretty easy to just take a couple shots of pomegranate juice every day too. Other things we can do to increase brain plasticity is estrogen. We've touched on that a little bit. Estrogen is made in the brain, and the most crucial time is the first 3 years of menopause. That's when the brain is deciding which receptors it's keeping and getting rid of, and which connections it's disrupting because estrogen's not there. So if you're using menopausal hormone therapy, estrogen therapy, in the first 3 years of menopause, it's been shown to increase new nerve production and new network connections. So it kind of like reconnects some of that pruning that's been done in perimenopause. And it's one of the things that increases that energy and that brain power. So this can even help to increase energy in the brain. It
What
might
if you
reduce,
miss the first 3 years?
if you miss the first 3 years, it still potentially could have some of these benefits, but it really depends on the individual and how many estrogen receptors they have retained. It's not necessarily that estrogen does anything different. It's more like it just can't like bind to the cells and like cause a change. And that goes the same way for like hot flashes and bone density with estrogen therapy. Like it depends on the receptors that you have left on your cells for estrogen.
And what does this mean for perimenopausal women?
For perimenopausal women, I mean, generally estrogen therapy is not considered because the estrogen's going high and low, and it's like too difficult to put that in. Um, I don't think having estrogen therapy in perimenopause would have too much of an effect as far as that pruning because as far as like stopping the pruning because there's other triggers to the pruning of perimenopause and the lower brain energy. Um,
Got it.
that we probably wouldn't be able to counteract at the same time. Yes, I know. Like, how can we avoid going through the dip? And
Right.
then back up. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Um, without causing an increased risk of uterine and breast cancer, I'm not sure if we'd be able to do that. So, yeah, thinking of overall health, I'm not sure. Um, if you have a risk of Alzheimer's or dementia in your family, or higher risk because of family history, you might want to consider menopausal hormone therapy after the 3 years, because the studies have shown that if you use it within the first 5 to 10 years of menopause, it can decrease your risk. So that's one of the things. But again, it's all dependent on how many receptors you still have. You can also eat foods for brain plasticity too. So not too many surprises here. Diet Coke's not on the list, but avocados, walnuts, green leafies, olive oil, broccoli, things you're eating for other reasons all the time too. Um, Most of these are because they're anti-inflammatory or increase blood flow to the brain, decrease toxins by improving liver detoxification. So these are good things to focus on too. I mean, I always think of walnuts for brain health because they look like brains, so that one's easy to remember. And I already mentioned with the procedural memory, working on new tasks, but certain things have been shown to increase plasticity as you age in the brain. And that's like it being able to be modified and learn new things. And that's one of the reasons that Joe and I started dancing. So it was to challenge ourselves, learn a new thing, and any activity where you're physically crossing right to left, that increases cross-brain plasticity and maintains connections across the brain. So that kind of goes for like martial arts, boxing. Actually, there's a lot of clinical studies with Parkinson's and boxing showing that specifically that cross-body movement improves plasticity. Um, Different types of art, gaming, and sleep. If you can sleep, do it. It's the best thing you can do for your brain. Um, a few other remedies to talk about. And you can always reach out to me if you have questions about these things, but these things that have like a lot of studies behind them. One is phosphatidylserine, mostly because it improves cortisol metabolism. So it kind of like takes away all the things that cortisol does as far as like blocking long-term memory recall and blocking the decrease of inflammation in the brain. So phosphatidylserine is something I recommend to patients a lot to help improve stress responses and improve sleep. Um, Studies have shown 300 milligrams a day in elderly adults supported memory and mood. And I think this was in adults that were over 70. The good thing about it is even though we use it for sleep, it's not a sedative. So it's like pretty safe to try for people. It doesn't affect their ability to like operate or doesn't make them groggy in the morning or anything like that. It just blocks, it helps that cortisol metabolism and undo some of the things that cortisol does in the brain. N-acetylcysteine is another like somewhat safer thing to like try. It's an antioxidant in the brain. It protects brain tissue from damage, mostly by decreasing inflammation. I also use N-acetylcysteine a lot to help ovulation and decrease ovarian cysts. So it's something that when I'm recommending supplements with patients, I'm always looking for them to help them in at least 2 or 3 areas instead of just like one pill for one symptom kind of thing. So when looking at the whole picture, we're looking at perimenopause, and someone that may have higher inflammation or starting to have like memory symptoms, and they're still ovulating most of the time, we might look at N-acetylcysteine. A lot of the studies on N-acetylcysteine are done in people with OCD and showing calming in the cortex and calming in the amygdala and hippocampus and reducing inflammation and to decrease OCD symptoms. So that's another good one. And another thing to look at may be neurotropics, which are anything that has the tropic at the end is something that kind of like helps like beneficial change. So I think of neurotropics as sort of like adaptogens for the brain. Like adaptogens help the adrenals. A lot of them are adaptogens like rhodiola. So this is a formula that I use a lot, primarily because it has phosphatidylserine, rhodiola, and bacopa. So if you kind of look at the different neurotropics and sort of like the different symptoms and supports that they give, this formula kind of like covers like 90% of them. So it's good, like covers a little bit of everything. And then we see how someone feels on this and then start looking at what's left. But I think this is a good chart for just kind of looking at, so if you see some of these ingredients in a brain support supplement or memory support supplement, you can know like really what they're trying to do. Because like I said, a lot of those supplements that say brain health are really for like advanced age, and not really going to help you get through like a stressful work day. It's a different strategy. Also, I wanted to mention my book club because we are reading The Menopause Brain right now. So if you're interested in more support on this or learning more about it, I would highly suggest this book. And we're meeting June 16th to talk about it. And that's something free I do is just to like help people out and create a community around all these things. And then I have all the summer topics set. So we're going into bone health and bone density next month. Then I decided as I was doing this talk that I should have dementia prevention kind of separate because there's just so much information. It's like a separate topic, but very specific, but there's lots of good information about it. And that includes Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia I'll touch on. And then in the surveys, a lot of people wanted to talk about nutrition. So I thought it'd be good to go back to nutrition, but talk more specifically of different strategies perimenopause versus menopause and postmenopause, because there's a little different foods to focus on. And then weight was also high on everyone's list too. So we'll talk about weight management in September.